The late afternoon sun draped a golden haze over the quiet Bakersfield streets, painting long shadows across neatly mowed lawns. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the sycamore trees lining the sidewalk, a soothing counterpoint to the rhythmic thud of a tennis ball hitting the pavement. 12-year-old Malik Carter, his lean frame radiating youthful energy, grinned as he launched the ball high into the air. His German shepherd, Shadow, a sleek silhouette against the vibrant green grass, tensed, his dark eyes fixed on the bright yellow arc. The air hung thick with the sweet scent of freshly cut grass, mingling with the faint, earthy aroma of Shadow's fur, warmed by the sun. Malik watched, a familiar warmth spreading through him. The comfortable silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant drone of a lawnmower. One second it was just a game of fetch. The next a gunshot, a scream. Mrs. Douglas, perched on her porch swing with a glass of iced tea, watched the familiar scene unfold. Malik and Shadow, a constant presence on the street, were a comforting sight. She often wondered about the boy's father, a man who carried an air of quiet intensity, a man she rarely saw smile. She'd heard whispers FBI, something important, dangerous even. But Malik, he was just a boy, full of life and laughter. She smiled faintly, her gaze shifting between the boy and his dog, a silent observer of their simple joy. She took a slow sip of her tea, the ice clinking softly against the glass, a mundane sound that would later echo in her memory with the chilling clarity of a gunshot. Shadow, muscles coiled like springs, launched himself towards a falling ball, a blur of black and tan. He loved this game, the thrill of the chase, the satisfying thud of the ball in his mouth, the proud wag of his tail when he returned it to Malik. His world, at that moment, consisted only of the ball, the scent of the grass, the warm sun on his back, and the familiar presence of his boy. He was oblivious to the black and white cruiser slowly turning onto the street, oblivious to the officer behind the wheel, whose eyes, narrowed against the glare of the sun, fixed on him with a sudden, inexplicable tension. Officer Daniels, his jaw tight, gripped the steering wheel. The day had been long, a relentless barrage of petty disputes and simmering tensions. His head throbbed, a dull ache that resonated with the frustration bubbling in his gut. He saw the dog, a large, dark shape hurtling across the lawn, and a primal fear, irrational and swift, tightened his chest. He thought of the news reports, the stories of aggressive breeds, the statistics that flashed through his mind, disembodied and devoid of context. He didn't see a boy playing fetch with his dog. He saw a threat, a dark, looming threat in a quiet, unsuspecting neighborhood. Just another day, he thought wearily, his hand instinctively reaching for his holster. Malik, his laughter still echoing in the air, saw the cruiser pull up. A flicker of unease, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, pricked at him. He opened his mouth to call Shadow back, a nameless premonition tightening his throat. But he was too late. The crack of the gunshot shattered the tranquility of the afternoon. The sound, sharp and brutal, reverberated through the quiet streets, bouncing off the neat rows of houses, lodging itself in the ears of everyone within a mile radius. Mrs. Douglas gasped, the iced tea spilling from her trembling hand, staining the concrete a watery brown. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, fixed on the scene unfolding before her, a grotesque tableau against the backdrop of a perfect suburban afternoon. Malik screamed, a high-pitched, heart-wrenching sound that tore through the stillness, a sound that spoke of a primal terror, a loss so profound it defied comprehension. His world, a moment ago filled with sunshine and the joyous rhythm of a game of fetch, imploded. The vibrant colors of the afternoon drained away, replaced by a sickening gray. He saw Shadow fall, a crumpled heap on the emerald green lawn, the tennis ball rolling a few feet away, a mocking reminder of the game they would never finish. Time seemed to slow, to stretch and distort as Malik ran towards his dog, his legs moving mechanically, his mind numb with shock. He knelt beside Shadow, his trembling hands reaching for the warm, still familiar fur. He felt a wetness on his fingers, a sticky warmth that he didn't want to understand. He looked up, his eyes, wide and unseeing, met the cold, impassive gaze of Officer Daniels. In that moment, something shifted within him. The innocence of childhood, the unquestioning trust in authority, fractured, leaving behind a raw, gaping wound. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stared, his gaze absorbing the scene, the officer, the gun, the blood staining the grass, a horrifying crimson, etching it all into his memory with the searing clarity of trauma. A quiet understanding, chilling in its depth, began to take root. This wasn't an accident. This was something else. Something he couldn't yet name, but something he knew, with a certainty that went beyond words, was wrong. The slam of a car door, the hurried footsteps approaching, broke the frozen tableau. Officer Reynolds, his face grim, surveyed the scene, his gaze flitting from the distraught boy to the fallen dog, to the rigid figure of his colleague, Officer Daniels. He understood, with a sinking feeling in his gut, the magnitude of what had just transpired. This wasn't just a dog. This was a child's world shattered, a community's trust broken, a stain on the badge he wore. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, a silent prayer for guidance, for strength, for the wisdom to navigate the storm he knew was coming. He opened them, his gaze settling on Daniels. "What the hell happened here, Daniels?" he asked, his voice low and tight, the unspoken accusation hanging heavy in the air. The quiet Bakersfield afternoon, once a picture of suburban tranquility, now held the pregnant silence of a gathering storm. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Maplewood Drive, painting the scene in hues of amber and gold. Officer Daniels, slumped low in his patrol car, felt the familiar weight of boredom pressing down on him. Another slow shift, another monotonous patrol through the same predictable streets. He'd seen it all in this town, the clipped hedges, the gleaming SUVs, the occasional stray cat. Nothing ever really happened in Bakersfield, not really. His hand idly tapped against the steering wheel, a rhythm to the hum of the engine, the low thrum a counterpoint to the silence of the neighborhood. Another day, another dollar, he thought, the phrase as worn and tired as the leather of his steering wheel. He needed a coffee, something stronger than the lukewarm sludge from the station's machine, something to cut through the tedium, the gnawing feeling of being stuck in a loop, a hamster on a wheel. He adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his own reflection in the tired eyes, the lines etched around his mouth. Getting too old for this, he muttered to himself, the thought fading as quickly as it appeared. He rounded the corner onto Willow Creek Lane, the street where those people had moved in a few months ago. He'd heard murmurs at the station, whispers about the new family, the Carters. A black family, an FBI agent, no less. Fancy that, he'd thought then, a flicker of something dark, something he wouldn't admit to, twisting in his gut. It wasn't a conscious prejudice, not exactly. More like an instinct, a learned response. Years on the force had conditioned him. He'd learned to associate certain demographics with certain behaviors. He scanned the houses, his gaze lingering a little too long on the Carter residence. A basketball hoop stood sentinel in the driveway, a bright red splash against the muted beige of the house. Then he saw it, a flash of movement, a dark blur against the green of the lawn. A large dog, a German shepherd, he registered, bounding across the grass, its powerful muscles rippling beneath its sleek black coat. A big black dog running towards the street. His mind flashed, a primal alarm ringing in his ears. His hand instinctively went to his holster. He hadn't even consciously processed the thought. It was pure reflex. The dog, he saw now, was chasing a tennis ball, its tongue lolling out in playful pursuit. A boy, small and dark-skinned, stood on the lawn, his arm outstretched, a second tennis ball clutched in his hand. But the image that seared itself into Daniels' mind wasn't that of a child playing fetch with his pet. It was the image of the dog, large and dark, running towards him. His training kicked in, years of drills and simulations flooding his consciousness. Threat. Neutralize. The world narrowed, the sounds of the quiet afternoon fading into the background. The boy's laughter, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves all gone, replaced by the pounding of his own heart, the rush of adrenaline. He braked hard, the patrol car screeching to a halt. His hand tightened on his gun. Protect and serve. The motto echoed in his mind, hollow and distorted. He rolled down the window, the sudden rush of air a stark contrast to the suffocating tension in the car. He didn't shout a warning, didn't try to assess the situation further. His fear, amplified by prejudice, had already made the decision for him. Boom! The shot tore through the quiet afternoon, a brutal punctuation mark to the innocent scene. The sound reverberated through the neighborhood, echoing off the neatly trimmed hedges and the pristine facades of the houses. The boy, Malik, froze, the second tennis ball slipping from his grasp. His eyes, wide with shock and disbelief, fixed on his dog, Shadow. Shadow, in mid-stride, crumpled to the ground, the tennis ball rolling to a stop a few feet away. The joyful momentum of the game, the innocent pursuit of the ball, was abruptly and violently extinguished. A whimper, thin and reedy, escaped Shadow's lips. Malik felt a coldness spread through him, a chilling numbness that started in his chest and radiated outwards, freezing his limbs, his thoughts, his very breath. No, he thought, the word a silent scream trapped in his throat. No, no, no. He wanted to run to Shadow, to hold him, to protect him, but his legs felt like lead, his body refusing to obey the commands of his desperate mind. He could only stand there, a statue of grief, watching the life drain from his beloved companion. Daniel stepped out of the car, his legs unsteady, a tremor running through him. The sudden silence that followed the shot was deafening. He could hear his own ragged breathing, the frantic thumping of his heart. He saw the boy, frozen in place, his eyes locked on the fallen dog. He saw the discarded tennis ball, lying innocently on the grass. The reality of what he had done, the sheer senselessness of it, began to seep into his consciousness. It was just a dog, he tried to tell himself, a big black dog. But the words felt hollow, inadequate, unable to fill the vast emptiness that was opening up inside him. Just a dog playing fetch, another voice whispered in his head, accusing and relentless. He looked at the boy again, at the raw pain etched on his young face, and felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Regret? Shame? Fear? He wasn't sure. He just knew that he had made a terrible mistake, a mistake that couldn't be undone, a mistake that would forever stain the quiet afternoon, the peaceful street, and the innocent heart of a 12-year-old boy. The crack of the gunshot echoed, a brutal punctuation mark in the quiet afternoon. The tennis ball, a vibrant yellow against the green lawn, rolled to a stop, untouched. Time seemed to fracture, the world tilting on its axis as 12-year-old Malik Carter watched his dog crumple. Shadow, his loyal German shepherd, had been mid-leap, a blur of joyful muscle chasing after the toss ball. Now, he lay still, a dark stain blooming on the grass beneath him. The sound of the shot still reverberated in Malik's ears, a physical blow that knocked the air from his lungs. A strangled cry tore from his throat, a primal scream of anguish that ripped through the peaceful suburban tableau. He scrambled toward Shadow, his knees scraping against the asphalt, a frantic prayer forming on his lips. Shadow! No, no, no! His mind, a whirlwind of confusion and terror, struggled to grasp the sudden, brutal shift from playful afternoon to chilling reality. Just moments ago, the world had been filled with the warmth of the sun, the happy panting of his dog, the familiar rhythm of their game of fetch. Now, a cold dread seeped into his bones, a terrifying premonition of loss he was too young to fully comprehend. Mrs. Douglas, peering through her lace-curtained window, gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The newspaper slipped from her grasp, the rustle of its fall a pathetic whisper against the horrific scene unfolding outside. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Other neighbors, drawn by the sharp report, emerged from their homes, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Whispers rippled through the gathering crowd, a murmur of horror and confusion. The tranquil afternoon had been shattered, replaced by a raw, palpable tension that hung heavy in the air. Malik reached Shadow, his small hands trembling as he touched the warm fur, already damp with blood. He couldn't understand. Shadow hadn't done anything wrong. He'd just been playing. The thought, simple and pure, clawed at his young mind, a desperate attempt to make sense of the senseless. Tears streamed down his face, blurring his vision, as he looked up at the police officer, the man who held the smoking gun. "He's not dangerous," he choked out, his voice thin and reedy, barely audible above the growing murmur of the crowd. Please, the plea, born of pure desperation, hung in the air, a fragile bubble of hope against the stark reality of the situation. Officer Daniels, his face pale and tight, lowered his weapon, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. The adrenaline that had surged through him moments before, fueling his impulsive action, began to recede, replaced by a dawning awareness of the gravity of what he had done. He had reacted instinctively, his perception colored by ingrained biases, by the sight of a large dog, a black child, in a predominantly white neighborhood. He had seen a threat where there was none. The weight of that realization settled heavily in his gut, a sickening knot of guilt and regret. Terrence Carter, Malik's father, arrived on the scene, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. He had been working from home, reviewing case files, when he heard the shot. His initial reaction was a primal surge of protective instinct, a visceral fear that gripped his heart. As he approached, the scene that met his eyes sent a wave of icy rage coursing through him. His son, kneeling beside his dying dog, his face streaked with tears. A police officer, gun still drawn, standing over them. The image seared itself into his memory, a brand of injustice that would forever alter the landscape of his soul. He moved with a controlled grace, his FBI training kicking in, suppressing the raw emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He knelt beside Malik, his hand resting gently on his son's shoulder, a silent reassurance in the midst of the storm. His gaze, sharp and unwavering, locked onto Officer Daniels. "He's not dangerous," Malik repeated, his voice choked with sobs. "Please, you just shot my son's dog." Terrence's voice was low and steady, each word carrying the weight of his authority, the controlled fury that simmered beneath the surface. The statement, devoid of accusation, was more potent than any shouted condemnation. It hung in the air, a stark indictment of the officer's actions, the undeniable truth of a senseless act of violence. Officer Daniels shifted uneasily under Terrence's gaze, his initial bravado crumbling under the weight of the man's quiet intensity. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some explanation, some justification, but the words caught in his throat. He had rehearsed this scenario countless times in his head, the practiced lines of self-defense, the justifications for the use of force. But none of them seemed adequate now. None of them could erase the image of the boy's grief, the father's controlled rage, the undeniable fact that he had shot a harmless dog, a beloved pet, in front of a terrified child. Officer Reynolds, his partner, arrived, taking in the scene with a practiced eye. He sensed the tension, the undercurrent of anger that crackled in the air. He saw the boy, the dog, the father, the gathering crowd, their faces a mixture of shock and outrage. He understood, with a clarity that eluded Daniels, the gravity of the situation. This wasn't a simple case of an officer discharging his weapon in the line of duty. This was a tragedy, a senseless act of violence that would reverberate through the community, further eroding the already fragile trust between law enforcement and the people they were sworn to protect. He placed a hand on Daniel's arm, a silent plea for restraint. The situation was volatile, a powder keg waiting for a spark. He needed to defuse it, to restore order before it escalated further. Mrs. Douglas, her voice trembling with indignation, spoke up, her words cutting through the tense silence. "I saw everything," she declared, her gaze fixed on Officer Daniels. "That dog wasn't attacking anyone. He was just playing fetch." Her testimony, clear and unwavering, added fuel to the growing fire of community outrage. Other voices joined hers, a chorus of condemnation, each word a testament to the injustice that had unfolded before their eyes. The whispers became murmurs, the murmurs grew into shouts, a wave of anger that threatened to engulf them all. The quiet suburban street, once a haven of peace and tranquility, had become a battleground, a stage for a conflict that exposed the raw wounds of racial bias and the deep-seated mistrust that simmered beneath the surface of their community. The afternoon sun, now casting long shadows across the lawn, seemed to amplify the scene, painting it in stark, unforgiving light. The yellow tennis ball lay forgotten on the grass, a silent witness to the tragedy, a stark reminder of the innocence lost. The acrid scent of gunpowder still hung heavy in the air, a bitter counterpoint to the lingering sweetness of freshly cut grass from Mrs. Douglas's meticulously maintained lawn. Malik knelt beside Shadow, his small hand trembling as he stroked the dog's rapidly cooling fur. He wasn't crying, not anymore. The initial shock and terror had given way to a hollow ache, a numbness that settled deep in his chest. He felt disconnected, as if watching a tragic play unfold on a distant stage. This can't be real, he thought, the words echoing silently in his mind. Shadow was just playing. The murmur of the gathering crowd grew louder, fueled by a shared indignation. Mrs. Douglas stood firm, her voice trembling with righteous anger as she recounted the events to the newly arrived officer. Officer Reynolds, his face grim, listened intently, his gaze shifting between the distraught boy and the defiant Officer Daniels. Daniels, his face pale and his jaw clenched, avoided eye contact. He shifted his weight uneasily, the silence amplifying the rustle of his uniform, a sound that grated on Malik's nerves like sandpaper. He knows he did wrong, Malik thought, the realization hardening his young heart. He knows. A black sedan pulled up sharply by the curb, the screech of tires momentarily silencing the growing unrest. The car door slammed shut with a force that reverberated through the quiet neighborhood. Malik looked up, his numbed senses barely registering the tall figure striding towards them. It was his father. Terrence Carter's usually composed features were contorted with a fury Malik had rarely seen. His eyes, normally filled with warmth, were now like chips of ice, radiating a controlled rage that sent a shiver down Malik's spine. Malik, his father's voice was low and tight, his words clipped. He knelt beside his son, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. A wave of relief washed over Malik, a fragile warmth in the face of the overwhelming cold. He felt a tear finally trace a path down his cheek, the first since Shadow had fallen. Terrence's gaze shifted to the fallen dog, his jaw tightening further. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken words. He then slowly rose, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the scene. He fixed his gaze on Officer Daniels, his eyes burning with an intensity that made the officer flinch. "You just shot my son's dog." Terrence's voice was deceptively calm, the controlled tone belying the storm raging beneath. He took a step closer to Daniels, the subtle movement filled with an unspoken threat. Daniels instinctively took a step back, his hand hovering near his holster. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that hung in the air like suspended dust motes. Officer Reynolds moved quickly, positioning himself between the two men, his hand resting lightly on Daniels' arm. "Sir, I understand your distress, but—" Reynolds began, his voice strained. Terrence cut him off, his voice rising. "Distress? My son was playing fetch with his dog. His dog, a 12-year-old boy and his pet. And you," he pointed a finger at Daniels, his voice laced with contempt, "you decided to execute him. In broad daylight, in a quiet neighborhood. For what? For chasing a ball." Daniels stammered. He was charging. "I felt threatened." The words hung in the air, flimsy and unconvincing. Mrs. Douglas scoffed, her voice loud and clear. "Threatened? That dog was wagging his tail. He was fetching a ball. I saw the whole thing. He was no threat to anyone." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, their faces a mixture of anger and disbelief. The weight of their collective gaze settled on Daniels, a palpable pressure that seemed to suffocate him. Terrence turned his back on Daniels, seemingly dismissing him entirely. He focused his attention on Reynolds, his voice regaining its controlled calm. "Officer," he said, his tone sharp, "I am Special Agent Terrence Carter, FBI. I expect a full and thorough investigation into this incident. I want to know why this officer," he gestured dismissively towards Daniels, "felt justified in using lethal force against a harmless animal in front of a child. I want to know everything." The revelation of Terrence's identity hung in the air, a sudden shift in the gravitational pull of the situation. Officer Reynolds' eyes widened, his face paling. He swallowed hard, the implications of the situation sinking in. This was no longer a simple neighborhood dispute. This was a federal agent, a man of power and influence, whose son's dog had been unjustly killed. Terrence turned back to Daniels, his eyes boring into him. "You just shot my son's dog," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. He paused, the silence amplifying the weight of his words. "If he was a white kid," he stated, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations, would Shadow still be alive? The question hung in the air, unanswered, unanswerable. It wasn't a question that required a verbal response. The answer was etched on Daniel's face in the averted gaze, the twitching jaw, the sweat beading on his forehead. It was in the silence of the crowd, a silence heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement of a truth they all knew too well. It was in the trembling hands of a 12-year-old boy, clutching the fur of his lifeless dog, a boy who was just beginning to understand the complexities of a world where justice wasn't always blind. The scent of gunpowder mingled with the smell of fear, creating a toxic cocktail that permeated the air, a stark reminder of the injustice that had unfolded on that quiet, sunny afternoon. The late afternoon sun, a molten orange bleeding into the dusty Bakersfield sky, cast long, distorted shadows across the lawn. Malik still knelt, his small frame trembling, the warmth of the blood on his hands a stark contrast to the icy grip of fear that clenched his chest. He hadn't moved since Shadow fell, hadn't dared to break the fragile connection, hadn't dared to breathe too deeply lest the shallow breaths escape, carrying pieces of his heart with them. He could feel the uneven thump of Shadow's heart against his palm, a desperate rhythm against the silence of the street. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ringing in his ears. "You're going to be okay." He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Shadow or himself. Officer Reynolds' voice, firm but laced with an unfamiliar gentleness, broke through Malik's despair. "Son, we need to let the paramedics take a look at him." Malik flinched. The paramedics meant letting go. He tightened his grip, burying his face in Shadow's fur. The familiar scent, usually a source of comfort, now a suffocating reminder of what he might lose. "He's my dog," he thought fiercely, the words echoing in the hollow spaces of his mind. "They can't take him from me." He felt a hand on his shoulder, a gentle but firm pressure. He looked up into the face of his father, Terrence. His dad's eyes, usually warm and full of laughter, were dark, shadowed with a rage Malik had never seen before. Yet his voice was calm, controlled. "Malik, they need to help him. Let them do their job." Terrence's words resonated with an authority that transcended the immediate situation. It was the voice of a man used to command, used to making difficult decisions. But Malik saw something else too, a flicker of vulnerability in the tight clench of his jaw, the subtle tremor in his hand. It was the vulnerability of a father watching his son's world crumble. Reluctantly, Malik loosened his grip. He watched, his breath catching in his throat, as the paramedics carefully lifted Shadow onto a stretcher. The rhythmic whine of the siren, fading into the distance, ripped through the quiet of the neighborhood, leaving behind a raw, echoing silence. The scene felt surreal. The neighbors, still gathered on the sidewalk, whispered amongst themselves, their voices a low hum against the backdrop of the setting sun. Mrs. Douglas, her face etched with concern, reached out and squeezed Malik's hand. Her touch, small and frail, offered a flicker of warmth in the growing cold. Across the lawn, Officer Daniels stood, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the empty space where Shadow had lain. He was a statue carved from guilt and fear, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. Terrence's gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering, unyielding. It wasn't just anger Malik saw in his father's eyes. It was a deep, unsettling disappointment, the kind reserved for betrayals that cut to the bone. Officer Reynolds approached Daniels, his expression grim. "Daniels," he said, his voice low, almost a murmur against the gathering dusk. "Hand over your firearm." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The rustle of whispers from the crowd intensified, the air thick with anticipation. Daniel's hand twitched towards his holster, then froze. He looked at Reynolds, a flicker of defiance flashing across his face. "What? What for?" Reynolds's voice was steady, unwavering. "You discharged your weapon in a residential area, endangering child. You're relieved of duty pending investigation." The silence that followed was broken only by the chirping of crickets, the sound amplified by the tension that permeated the air. Daniel's face contorted in a mixture of disbelief and anger. "This isn't fair," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It was just a dog." Reynolds' eyes hardened. "This isn't just about a dog, Daniels. This is about a system where some people don't get second chances. This is about a boy who lost his best friend because you acted on prejudice, not fact." His words were precise, measured, each syllable carrying the weight of accumulated injustice. He continued, his voice rising slightly, "and about a community that's tired of being treated like a threat." The weight of Reynolds' words seemed to crush Daniels. The defiance in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a dull resignation. Slowly, almost mechanically, he unholstered his weapon and handed it to Reynolds. Terrence watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. The surrender of the weapon wasn't enough. It was a small victory in a much larger battle. He knew that the fight for justice had just begun. This wasn't about retribution. It was about accountability. It was about ensuring that no other child had to witness the senseless killing of their beloved companion, that no other family had to endure this pain. "This is for you, son," he thought, his gaze softening as he looked at Malik. "This is for Shadow." The arrival of animal control broke the tense tableau. They carefully loaded Shadow, still on the stretcher, into their van. Malik watched, his heart aching, a fresh wave of grief washing over him. He wanted to go with Shadow, to stay by his side, but he knew he couldn't. He turned to his father, his eyes filled with a question he couldn't articulate. Terrence understood. He knelt beside Malik, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. "They're taking him to the best veterinary clinic in town, Malik. He's going to get the best care possible." Malik nodded, a small, choked sob escaping his lips. He didn't know if Shadow would be okay. He didn't know what the future held. But in the midst of the fear and the grief, he felt a flicker of hope, a small ember of resilience ignited by the unwavering support of his father, by the quiet solidarity of his community. And in that moment, he knew that he wasn't alone. The sterile scent of disinfectant bit at Terrence Carter's nostrils, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of blood that still clung to his clothes. He sat rigidly in the uncomfortable plastic chair of the veterinary clinic's waiting room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like an insistent fly. He hadn't moved from this spot for hours, his gaze fixed on the closed door leading to the operating room. Beyond that door, his son's world hung in the balance. He could still see the terror in Malik's eyes, hear the desperate whimper escaping his lips as they rushed Shadow, bleeding and limp, into this cold, impersonal space. "He's just a boy," Terrence thought, the words a bitter mantra against the rising tide of rage within him. 12 years old, and they've already stained his world with this. Malik sat beside him, smaller than usual, huddled in a borrowed blanket. His silence was more unnerving than any scream. The boy's normally vibrant eyes were dull, reflecting the stark white walls of the waiting room. He clutched a worn tennis ball in his hand, the same ball Shadow had been chasing, the same ball that had led to this nightmare. Terrence reached out, his hand hovering over Malik's shoulder. He wanted to offer comfort, to pull his son close, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow, meaningless against the weight of what had happened? What could he say to erase the image of Officer Daniels, his face contorted in fear and prejudice, pulling the trigger? The image burned in Terrence's mind, a searing brand of injustice. The waiting room door opened, and a young woman in scrubs emerged, her face etched with weariness. Malik's head snapped up, the dullness in his eyes momentarily replaced by a flicker of desperate hope. Terrence felt his own heart clench, a painful mix of anticipation and dread twisting in his gut. He stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the linoleum floor. "How is he?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The vet hesitated, her gaze shifting between father and son. "He's stable," she said finally, the words heavy with unspoken implications. The bullet, it missed his vital organs. "We were able to control the bleeding." She paused, drawing a deep breath. "He's going to make it." Relief washed over Terrence, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He looked at Malik, saw the tension slowly release from the boy's small frame, the tears finally spilling down his cheeks. They weren't tears of grief, but of relief, of a child's pure, unadulterated joy. In that moment, Terrence felt a surge of something akin to gratitude, a flicker of light in the darkness that had enveloped them. He knelt beside Malik, pulling him into a tight embrace. "He's okay, son," he murmured, the words thick with emotion. "Shadow's going to be okay." But even as he held his son, the undercurrent of anger remained. It simmered beneath the surface, a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He knew this wasn't over. This wasn't just about a dog. It was about something far deeper, far more insidious. It was about the fear in Officer Daniels' eyes, the casual disregard for a young black boy and his beloved pet. It was about the assumptions, the prejudices that had led to a trigger being pulled, a life almost lost. Later that evening, as Malik dozed fitfully in a chair beside Shadow's recovery cage, Terrence sat in the quiet of his hotel room, the events of the day replaying in his mind. His phone buzzed incessantly, a constant stream of notifications. The incident had gone viral. Videos of the shooting, captured by bystanders, were circulating online, sparking outrage and protests. The name Officer Daniels was trending alongside hashtags like Justice for Shadow and Black Lives Matter. He scrolled through the comments, a mixture of support and vitriol filling his screen. Some questioned Malik's actions, suggesting that Shadow must have been aggressive. Others condemned Officer Daniels, calling for his immediate dismissal. The raw, unfiltered emotions of the online world mirrored his own. He felt a strange disconnect, as if he were watching his own life unfold from a distance. The phone rang, breaking through the digital cacophony. It was Mrs. Douglas, the elderly neighbor who had witnessed the shooting. Her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and indignation. "Agent Carter," she said, "I saw everything. That boy, that dog, they did nothing wrong. That officer, he just shot him." She paused, her breath hitching in her throat. "He's stable. He's okay. If you weren't FBI, do you think they would have done anything?" Her question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Terrence closed his eyes, the weight of her words settling upon him like a physical burden. He knew she was right. If he wasn't Terrence Carter, special agent of the FBI, if he was just another black man in Bakersfield, would they have even bothered to save Shadow? Would they have listened to Malik's terrified pleas? Would they have even acknowledged the injustice of it all? The answer was a bitter pill to swallow, a stark reminder of the realities he faced, the realities his son now faced. He opened his eyes, the fire of resolve burning within him. "Mrs. Douglas," he said, his voice low and steady, "I promise you, this will not be swept under the rug. Justice will be served." He wasn't just speaking to her. He was speaking to himself, to Malik, to Shadow, to every person who had ever been marginalized, silenced, and wronged. This wasn't just about a dog anymore. It was about a system, a culture that needed to change. And he, Terrence Carter, would be the instrument of that change. The silence in the car was thick, a suffocating blanket woven from the remnants of the day's trauma. Malik stared out the window, the passing streetlights painting fleeting streaks of light across his face, each one highlighting the tear tracks still etched on his cheeks. The world outside seemed to move at a different speed, a stark contrast to the frozen landscape of his inner world. He saw the blurred images of houses, trees, other cars, but they registered as nothing more than fleeting phantoms, unable to penetrate the wall of grief that had erected itself around him. He clutched the worn tennis ball in his hand, the same ball Shadow had chased with such boundless joy just hours ago. It felt cold now, lifeless, a stark reminder of the warmth and vitality that had been so cruelly extinguished. He wasn't crying anymore, not outwardly. The tears had dried, leaving behind a hollow ache that resonated deep within his chest, a constant, throbbing pulse of sorrow. He wanted to speak, to ask the question that clawed at his throat, but the words seemed trapped, caught in the barbed wire of his grief. Beside him, Terrence Carter gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the dark leather. The silence in the car was a mirror of the storm raging within him. Outwardly, he maintained the composed demeanor of a man accustomed to control, a man trained to compartmentalize, to analyze, to act. But beneath the surface, a torrent of emotions warred for dominance: rage, grief, a profound sense of helplessness. He glanced at Malik, his son, his heart aching at the sight of the boy's quiet despair. He wanted to offer words of comfort, of reassurance, but what could he say? What words could possibly mend the gaping wound ripped open by such senseless violence? He knew that this wasn't just about a dog, not just about Shadow. This was about the fear that had flashed in Malik's eyes when the officer raised his gun, the fear that mirrored his own childhood experiences, the fear that came from knowing that in the eyes of some, their skin color was a threat. He had spent his life fighting against that fear, fighting for justice, for equality, and yet, here it was staring him in the face, embodied in the lifeless form of his son's beloved companion. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus on the road ahead, on the task at hand getting his son home, safe. "Dad," Malik's voice was barely a whisper, fragile, like a bird's broken wing. Carter's grip on the steering wheel loosened slightly. "Yes, son." Malik turned, his eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, finally meeting his father's. Why did he do that? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations, with the weight of a world where such things could happen. Carter swallowed, the words catching in his throat. How could he explain the complexities of prejudice, of fear, of power misused, to a 12-year-old boy who had just witnessed such a brutal act of injustice? He searched for the right words, words that wouldn't shatter the remaining fragments of his son's innocence, words that would somehow make sense of the senseless. "Sometimes," he began, his voice low and steady, "people make mistakes, Malik, terrible mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes are fueled by things they don't even understand themselves." He paused, the inadequacy of his words echoing in the silence. He knew he had to say more, had to offer more than platitudes, more than vague explanations. That officer, he saw Shadow running, playing, and he was scared. He didn't see a happy dog fetching a ball. He saw something else. He hesitated, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. He saw a threat. He saw danger. He saw a black boy and his dog, and he reacted out of fear, out of prejudice. Malik remained silent, his gaze fixed on the tennis ball in his hand. Carter could see the wheels turning in his young mind, grappling with the enormity of what had happened. He knew that this incident would leave a scar, a mark that would likely never fully fade. He knew that his son, like him, would now carry the weight of this experience, the burden of understanding that the world wasn't always fair, that sometimes the worst things happen for no reason at all. "But that's not right, Dad," Malik finally said, his voice gaining a flicker of strength, a spark of defiance. "Shadow wasn't hurting anyone. He was just playing. I know, son. I know." Carter's voice was laced with a quiet intensity, a resolve that went beyond the immediate situation, that reached into the heart of the systemic issues that had led to this moment. "And that's why we fight. This isn't just about one dog, one officer, one mistake. It's about a system that sometimes sees things differently depending on who you are or what you look like. He paused, gathering his thoughts, searching for the words that would encapsulate the complex reality of their situation, of their lives. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound in the stillness. He turned to face Malik, his gaze steady, his voice firm. "We fight for justice, Malik. We fight for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it seems impossible. We fight because Shadow deserve better. We fight because you deserve better. We fight because everyone deserves better." He reached out, his hand covering Malik's small fist, still clutching the tennis ball. "And we won't stop fighting, son. Not until things change." The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the suffocating silence of grief, but the pregnant silence of understanding, of shared resolve. The streetlights continued to paint fleeting streaks of light across Malik's face. But now, they illuminated not just tear tracks, but a flicker of something else, something new, the dawning awareness of injustice, and a quiet determination to fight against it. The road ahead was long, and the fight would be hard, but they would face it together, father and son, bound by the memory of Shadow and by the shared hope for a better future.